Let's bring in Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, the national co-chair for President Biden's 2024 re-election campaign. Senator, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. So President Biden says the economy is strong, that his administration is spurring U.S. manufacturing and creating good-paying jobs. That's not how the American people see it. In a recent CNN poll, 66% of Americans say they disapprove of the president's handling of the economy. 76% of Americans say that our current economic conditions are poor. Obviously, some of the factors driving this is the cost of living is up, and people might feel that the president's out of touch with the American people on the state of the economy.
Well, Jake, the reality on the ground is that we are seeing the strongest job growth in decades. We have the lowest unemployment in 50 years. Just this week, the announcement that there were 500,000 new jobs created by the private sector in the month of June. Overall, 13 million jobs created by our private sector in the 2.5 years President Biden's been in office. That's the strongest recovery of any advanced economy on earth from the depths of the pandemic. And so, yes, there is a gap between the polling, the perception, and the reality on the ground and in the daily lives of Americans. Look, if I were facing re-election, I'd prefer strong on-the-ground reality of great jobs and good opportunities and needing to communicate about it than the opposite, having a positive perception but very weak numbers on the ground. President Biden is in South Carolina today because he and his cabinet and his supporters in Congress are fanning out across the country to engage Americans and to help inform them about exactly what he's gotten done in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the growth in manufacturing. Jake, the news is really good on the job front.
So the perception, obviously, that he's weak on the economy is leading to high disapproval numbers for President Biden among the electorate in general. Among Democrats, there's a problem, too. In a recent Fox poll, Robert Kennedy Jr., who's running against him for the Democratic nomination, Robert Kennedy Jr. polling at 17%, despite being a conspiracy theorist. Marianne Williamson is at 10%. Biden is obviously well in the lead at 64%, but still, that's almost 30% of the vote not going to Biden. How do you explain this?
Well, Jake, I'm confident that as Americans focus on the real choice in front of them, which will almost certainly between re-electing President Biden or re-electing former President Donald Trump, that the focus on that contest will be to the benefit of President Biden. He has a very strong record of governance. And folks, I think, will choose competence and positive progress over chaos and division. The ways in which former President Trump continues to behave, just releasing the address of former President Obama, leading to a potential threat on his life, the recklessness of former President Trump, I think will end up making the overwhelming majority of Americans choose President Biden for the re-election in 2024.
Let's turn to foreign affairs and the subject of wrongfully detained Americans overseas. Today, the Wall Street Journal wrote about the burdensome fines that these Americans can face after returning home. Quote, when Washington Post correspondent Jason Rezaian was released from Iran after 544 days of imprisonment, he said his welcome home came with bills of $20,000 for unpaid taxes, late payment penalties, and interest. Now, you and Senator Mike Rounds have introduced a bill to address this. Tell us about that.
So the title of the bill, Jake, tells you everything you need to know. It's called the Stop Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act. Like you, I was flabbergasted when Jason Rezaian, a Washington Post reporter, came to meet with me and told me that story, that upon returning from more than 500 days in an Iranian jail, he was greeted with IRS tax penalties. And so Senator Mike Rounds and I, he's a good friend, a Republican senator, introduced a bipartisan bill. We're hoping we can pass it unanimously, because who would stand for the idea that someone who has been wrongfully detained, imprisoned, whether in Russia or Iran or North Korea or another place in the world, should come home and face a tax penalty because they were unable to pay their taxes while detained overseas?
It does sound crazy. Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, thanks so much for being with us.